You know, once you let the smoke out of a wire, it's really hard to get it back in. There it goes. We're gonna call the fire department. Have you ever wanted to do a modification to your car only to get scared away by doing the wiring? For most people, doing the wiring is the most intimidating part of any car modification. And the last thing you want to do is a bunch of work, all to end up nuking your wiring. Now, if you're a beginner, you can't watch this video. Okay, of course, I'm kidding. But we are gonna get pretty technical, so you really need to make sure you watch the entire video because I'm going to demystify all of this. This is my RS3 swapped Golf R, and the #1 question I got in the series was, how did you do the wiring? And I absolutely love that question. First thing we need to cover is reading a wiring diagram. VW and Audi wiring diagrams are different and can be pretty confusing, and if you don't know how to read one of these, you're gonna really struggle to figure this stuff out. It used to be, we could just get a Bentley manual for our car and that had everything, including wiring diagrams. But they don't make these for our cars anymore, so we have to go to the internet machine. Now, with our obnoxiously large cursor, we are going to navigate to a website called irwin.vw.com. This is going to be our gateway to accessing the equivalent of the factory repair manual. We are then going to go to the subscriptions, and we're going to buy a 1-day subscription, including printing rights, for $35. Make sure you set some time aside and just download everything that you're going to need in that 24-hour time period. Essentially, this is going to give us dealership level access to the repair manual. And since we're taking the engine out of the Audi, putting it in a Volkswagen, we need an Audi diagram and a Volkswagen diagram. For that, we are going to go to a website called irwin.audiusa.com, and we're gonna buy a 1-day subscription, including printing rights for our Audi. Once you've purchased both of those subscriptions, we're gonna find our wiring diagrams, which are going to look like this. On the left, we have the 2-liter from the Golf, and on the right, we have the 2.5-liter for the RS3. Now, for this first part, we're gonna keep it pretty basic, and I'm only gonna be focusing on the 2-liter. And don't worry, we're not gonna go page by page through this entire wiring diagram and bore everyone, including me. As you look at this diagram, if you've ever looked at a wiring diagram before, you're thinking, what the heck is going on? Let's start with some real basics here. So this is the first page of our engine wiring diagram. Here on the left is our full diagram for this particular page. You'll notice that this is a little squiggly here. That means that more of this is located in another wiring diagram. The arrow on this side means that it continues on to the next page. Now, at the top, we have some fuses. We also have some relays. You'll also see this little SB right here. This refers to our SB fuse panel, which is this one underneath the hood. Over on the right, we have our outline of everything that's included in the diagram. We have our battery, we have our starter, we have our battery monitoring control module, which is that little plug-in module on the negative terminal of the battery. We have 2 starter relays, our SB fuse panel, of course, and then some fuses on the SB fuse panel. Then we have these circles here. This is gonna indicate splices or junctions. And then we have some asterisks down here at the bottom to signify different equipment. For example, if you have an automatic versus a manual transmission. Now, keep in mind, every single bit of information on this whole entire page is super important and valuable. It's also cool because we get the color breakdown on every page. And the reason these may look a little weird is because they're actually translated from German, which is why GE is yellow. The important thing to note is power and ground generally flow this way. Powers are at the top and grounds are at the bottom. You'll also notice here at the bottom these numbers. These are for our wiring track. If we go to number 8 here, slide up, and we see this little box that says 88, that means if we go to 88 on this track, we're gonna find the other side of this wire. You're gonna have to make sure you know that real well because you're gonna be bouncing around this wiring diagram pretty aggressively. At position 2, 13, and 14, our wire stops at the bottom. This means we've come to a grounding location. For this one, we see this 12 in the circle. We'll come over to here, 12 in the circle, ground connection in the engine compartment left. This is most likely the grounding connection that lives just behind the battery on the firewall in the Golf. Sometimes you'll see you get a little bit of a breakout up here at the top of a relay. You don't always get this in every diagram. For example, here, this battery maintenance module, example, you have 2 wires in and then voodoo happens and we don't know what that actually is. So unfortunately, sometimes we're just out of luck with getting the full information, but let's find a component and go a little bit deeper. Now, before we get too deep, I want to just point out something real quick here. J623 is our engine control module. If you look right here, we see T91/5. This means we're on the 91 pin connector, pin number 5. So when I mentioned I built that binder and listed out all the different pin locations for the 91 pin connector, I basically looked at this wiring diagram and went page by page. Anytime I find a T91/whatever, I would notate it, notate the wire color, and then trace it down to see where it went. The component I'm going to use for this example is going to be the exhaust flaps. This is a pretty simple circuit, but it ticks all the boxes that I need to show you exactly how to test drive one of these wiring diagrams without overcomplicating it. So here's our module down at the bottom. We have 3 wires that connect to it. T3XB. The 3 indicates this is a 3-pin connector. The /1 is the position, 2 is the position, 3 is the position. We have signal, we have 87A, which I'll get to what that is in a second, and then we have our ground. When it comes to grounds, it's pretty safe to assume that if you have a brown wire, it will be a ground. Not all grounds are going to be brown, and not all brown wires will be ground, but it's kind of a rule of thumb. This is why we use the wiring diagram, so we don't have to accidentally get it wrong. So let's start with our ground because we can finish it on this same page. You notice we have 2 wires coming out here with asterisks. So we don't actually have 2 wires coming out of this pin. It's only gonna be 1. 1 wire comes up, this solid circle is a splice, ground connection in rear harness, then it goes to a main ground. Notice the wire sizes are different. That's what this number is right here. That's the wire size in millimeters, and then terminates in the left rear wheel housing. Now, because this ground connection terminates in the left rear wheel housing, odds are this is the diagram for our left rear exhaust flap. The other option is actually this connector junction right here that it may or may not go through. TAGK, exhaust door control unit coupling point. Not exactly sure what that is or where it is. This car might not even have that. But either way, whether it does or it doesn't, they both end up terminating the ground right here in the left wheelhouse. When we look at pin 2, we kind of have the same thing. We have a violet wire that goes to this little box number 77. And then we have one that comes out, goes to the same junction, and goes up to number 76. This is where our track numbers down at the bottom come into play. So if we go a whole bunch of screens back, notice we have 368 and 369. Here's our 76 and 77 that were indicated on that last page. This is the location that we came from. The wires come up, they go to this junction right here. So we have a 17-pin connector in the TIUL, which is the coupling point in the interior bottom left. So this is that 4 connector junction right where the dead pedal is. So we go into that connector and go out of that connector, still a violet wire. Look where we terminate, T91/10. So this wire goes right to our ECM because our ECM is what's going to tell the flap open or close. Let's look at this final wire, which I think is pretty safe to say is going to be our power wire. We go to location 82 for this one and 84 for this one. Just like for the violet wire, let's go to 82 and 84 on the track locator. Here's 82, here's 84, B350, positive connection, so we know this is power. I'm guessing that this wire and this wire are coming from the other exhaust flap. We go into another 17-pin connector junction, we have another splice, and if we look at these 2 wires, one goes to 33, one goes to 338. Let's see where 33 takes us. 33 came from 79, SB10. Here's where our main source of power is. So if we were tracing this wire, we might actually work the other way, but now we know fuse 10 for our exhaust flaps. Now it might feel like we're skipping all over the place in this wiring diagram, and that's actually really common when you're looking at a lot of stuff in a diagram. This is why I like to use the digital version, but also if you can, have a printed version as well. This also allows you to write little notes and things like that, so maybe you don't have to keep flipping all the way from one side of the diagram to the other. Just so we know the circuit better, let's go the other way and see what 338 brought us. Looks like we're going through another junction, 203, From 337, we have a splice, and we come down to V488, which is a heater support pump, N205, which is a cam adjustment solenoid. So all 4 of these components, as well as our exhaust flaps, are all powered by the same fuse. Now, do we really need to know that the exhaust flaps share a fuse with a bunch of other components? To tell you the truth, I'm not sure yet. That's not something we're really gonna know till we get deeper into the wiring diagram. We do know, though, that we can't just eliminate that fuse if we wanted to kill the exhaust flap. We have to account for other things on that fuse. So looking at this J945 exhaust flap may seem crazy simple. It's just 3 wires, but it doesn't matter whether it's 3 wires like this or all 91, your steps and your workflow are gonna be the same. Now, this stuff can get pretty hard, and the only way you're ever gonna get good at it is practice, practice, practice. In fact, so much so when I was in Volkswagen Academy, we had to use colored pencils to trace out wiring diagrams for different circuits, and here we are, a million years later, still doing the same thing. All right, now that we have a good understanding of that, how do we take that information and apply it to something like an engine swap? Well, I built this binder that has all the wiring diagrams and other relevant information in it so that I could refer to it. In addition to this, I printed out the wiring diagrams, put them up on the wall so that we could easily access the numbers and trace all of our wiring locations at a glance. Under the hood is where the majority of our fun was had. We had 4 major things that we did to make this engine work. There's 2 connectors that plug into the ECM. The top one stayed with the engine. We didn't have to touch a single wire in that whole connector. The bottom one is the one that we completely repinned. You'll hear me refer to that one as the 91 pin connector. They call it a 91 pin connector because it has 91 holes in it for you to put in pins. Our next major change was these 2 connectors right down here. Similar to the ECM, one side of this connector stayed with the engine. We didn't have to touch it. The other side we did have to repin. The gray one I brought over from the RS3 and we repinned it. The smaller black one we actually had to completely change because in the Golf, that connector's a 10 pin connector, and in the Audi, it's only 8 pins, so we had to move both of those. The 91 pin connector does not have 91 pins in it, thankfully, but it does have all of our power wires, our ground wires, our communication with the rest of the car, a bunch of stuff for the fuse panel, our oxygen sensors, the gas pedal, and things like that. Our next major step was repinning part of the fuse panel. So we actually added this whole leg in the fuse panel over from the RS3. There were a couple of different relays in the Golf versus the RS3, and then the majority of the pins on this side of our fuse panel needed to be swapped around. Some of that stuff was depinning from the Golf fuse panel and just putting in another location. Others, I depinned the fuse panel from the Audi and brought it over to the Golf. Our final major thing under the hood when it comes to wiring is adding our jump start post right here. You'll notice we don't have a battery under the hood. That's because the RS3 has the battery in the trunk. And wanting to keep this car as OEM as possible, I decided to add all of that. And honestly, out of all this wiring, this was probably the easiest one because we just took it all out of the Audi and put it in the Golf. All right, I got our wiring diagram hung up on the wall. This allows me to, at a glance, look at it. I can trace my numbers just like we did on the computer. So this is really helpful. But how do we take this and actually apply it to our wiring for our car? That is a great question. So this is the 91 pin connector for our ECM. This was really the star of the show and the one that got the majority of the wiring done to it. We did our wiring 2 different ways. We have D-pin, repin, and we have cut and splice. Let's look at the D-pin, repin first because that is my favorite way to do it. Not only does it give you a more OEM look, but you don't have like a big jumble of wires in one spot, and you don't introduce more failure points than you already are going to have. Inside of here, we have this little purple lock. This is called the secondary lock. Sometimes you don't have to take it all the way out. Sometimes it just like pops free. That holds our wires in place. Our primary lock, you're going to need some kind of de-pinning tool like this one. This is actually a factory Volkswagen tool, an old one at that. And what we do is we go into the connector, just like that. That'll depress 2 tabs, in this case anyway. Push that in, and then we can pull the wire right out. When you find the new location for this wire, you just slide it back in. You'll hear it click, do all your pins, and then don't forget to put your secondary lock back in. There's a couple of important things about this 91 pin connector and a lot of these bigger connectors that are going to be important to note. We have 6 holes over here. You can see this is the bigger wires. Those are our powers and grounds on both the RS3 and the Golf. All the rest of these holes here are all spots for wires to go. And if you notice, like right here, there's a super tiny number 74. Those are the pin locations. So you really only get locations on the ends, which means you have to count. So if you don't count right, or you count the backwards way, you can really get yourself into trouble. And to be very blunt, I did this about 3 or 4 times while I was repinning this connector. That's what you get. Late night, depin, repin, Charles. Doesn't always count right. The other thing you'll probably notice is all these little blue tape flags. This was a lifesaver. As I went through the things I wasn't sure about, I would leave myself little notes. If you're doing anything like this that has multiple wires, do something like this, whether you use a Dymo labeler or I liked masking tape and a Sharpie marker. Label, 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 document, document, document. That is going to be a huge part of doing anything like this. Now, thankfully, I was able to depin and repin probably 90% of the wires for that whole swap, which is absolutely my favorite thing. But there were a couple of things that needed to be cut and spliced. Let me show you what that looks like. We're gonna start with our seam ripper, cut our wire, we strip, and without touching it, go right on there. We use our crimpers, and this is gonna make this harness a little awkward, but that's okay. Crimp again. What's cool about these is they have heat shrink on them, so you can heat shrink it and it seals that whole wire up. But you never want to do that until you test everything and make sure it works. Otherwise, you might be ending up cutting and splicing multiple times. Now, what's cool about doing this in the way that I'm showing you, as long as you do it right, this is essentially a factory authorized Volkswagen Audi wiring repair. Also, I will link up all of these things down in the description. That way you have all the proper stuff to do a wiring repair yourself. Okay, that's all fine and good, but how did we actually make it work? For that, we gotta go to the computer and I'm gonna use the gas pedal as our example. Now, I mentioned earlier that I spent a bunch of time digging through the wiring diagram, and this document is a result of all that studying. On the left, we have the Golf. On the right, we have the RS3, all of the pin locations listed out, the component that they go to, the wire color, and any notes that I had written while reading the diagram. I have a box here in the middle, so really, all I did was go pin by pin, moving as needed, and check them off as I went. And then over here, just any notes, because of course, when you're reading a wiring diagram, you're gonna run into things that don't quite add up. Here is our gas pedal that we're gonna use as an example. Now, what's cool is these gas pedals are basically the same, and they function pretty much the same too. Up at the top is our ECM, and you'll notice that our ECM pin locations are different from the Golf to the Audi. The pedal that we're using is the one in the Golf, so what I did was I took the pins from the Golf gas pedal and pinned them the way that the Audi gas pedal is pinned. Let me give you an example of that because this can get confusing really, really quick. Let's start with pin 1 for the Golf gas pedal. When we follow it up, we see that it goes to T91/16. So that's position 16 in the ECM connector. When we look at the Audi gas pedal, pin 1 goes into position 65. I depinned the wire in position 16 in the original Golf ECM harness, and then I took that wire and put it in position 65 of that new connector that I bought, the one that's going to be plugged in to the Audi ECM. Now, unfortunately, our wire colors aren't gonna be quite right if we only follow the Audi diagram, but that's okay because the pin locations are gonna be correct. Moving right along, pin 2 in the gas pedal goes to 33 of the ECM. Pin 2 of the Audi goes to 82. So same thing, pin out of location 33 and into location 82. Pin 3 goes to 34 on the Golf. We need it to go to 84. And really, that's all it was. And as I went, I would check them off down the list, and about every maybe 7 to 10 wires I would stop. I would go back and recheck just to make sure everything lined up exactly where it needed to be. I also did the same thing for the seats, a very similar diagram. We have the Golf on the left, the RS3 on the right. This was a little bit trickier because there were some splices that didn't quite line up on the Golf and the Audi. And the Audi has 4 connectors where the Golf only has 2, but it was the same method and same strategy as I used for the ECM. So I got it to work. Now we have another major piece of this wiring puzzle, and that's relocating the battery from under the hood to in the trunk. Starting with our positive cable, this is the cable directly out of the RS3. I drilled one hole in the floorboard on the driver's side for this cable to pass through. It runs down the driver's side of the trunk to our circuit breaker. That way, if we have any kind of catastrophic issue, it won't burn our whole car to the ground. Then we have a short cable to the positive terminal of this battery. You'll notice we have two batteries, and they look kind of small. These are two 6-volt batteries wired in series for a total of 12 volts. Because it's wired in series, we have a cable coming out of the negative terminal of this battery running to the positive terminal of the other one. Then on the negative terminal of the passenger side battery, I use the cable from the RS3 that has the battery maintenance module. This wire did get run up to the front lower A pillar, and then it goes to a ground stud that we welded in the floorboard on the passenger side. Now we also have all this air ride stuff in here. That's likely going to be coming out at some point soon. Now, in addition to under the hood and in the trunk, we had a couple of other things we needed to splice and connect. One is the fuel pump. The RS3 fuel pump is a brushless pump. It has a couple of more wires. I also added a ground to the fuel pump to make sure we had proper grounding. Just like with the fuel pump, the leak detection pump connector was different, pins were different. Unfortunately, we did end up cutting and splicing those. However, out of all the wires that we messed with, only having to cut and splice a handful, I would say, was pretty good. All right, so we just went deep in wiring a new engine into a modern car. But what if you want to wire up a modern engine like this into an old car? You probably remember the Mark III Jetta that Paul and I did a 2-liter turbo DSG swap in. While that 2-liter turbo came out of basically the same platform car, it presented a lot of differences and a bunch of other challenges. When swapping my Golf, not only did I want this to look like it came from the factory this way, I wanted it to act that way too, meaning I want everything to work properly. In the Jetta, we didn't have a lot of stuff. That Jetta only has like 5 modules and probably 2 or 3 you can actually talk to, where the GTI we pulled the engine out of had a ton of different modules. So we had to take a little bit different approach. We did a lot of process of elimination. In a lot of ways, making the Jetta work was actually a little bit trickier. Unless you want to swap everything over, like the ABS module and the electrics module and the instrument cluster and the steering lock module and on and on and on, we had to figure out the bare minimum of modules that were needed to make the engine run. Now, in the case of the Jetta and in the case of my Golf R, we needed a couple of things to happen with both the ECM and TCM. Paul sent the ECM to Unitronic, just like I did with the Golf, to have immobilizer defeated, to have the car tuned, and to have some of those controls eliminated so that the ECM wasn't upset, causing drivability problems. All right, so how do you set yourself up for the most amount of success while doing your wiring? Well, you follow these tips. The first one is to study. I spent about a week every evening looking at both the Golf diagram and the RS3 diagram just to get my head around what I was actually looking at. Sometimes you'll run into something in a wiring diagram and it's not even a real thing, at least in the country you're in, so you can make notes of that and know going in that that spot might be a problem. Number 2, document. This might be the most important thing of this whole entire video. One of the smartest things I did was build that spreadsheet for all the pins in those 2 main engine connectors on the Golf. That saved so much time and so much effort. I could just find the pin, move it, document the wire color, and then put a check, and then I never had to worry about it again. Paul and I have none of that on the Jetta. So if he runs into a problem, he's gonna basically be starting from square one on any kind of diagnosis, and that is going to be a big challenge. Look at all the little blue flags on wire ends. Look at all the random notes that I had all over the place. All of that was part of the documentation to help the job go smoother and to avoid making mistakes. Number 3, go slow. Wiring is not a place to flat rate things and work as fast as you can. There was a saying I heard many, many years ago: if you don't have time to do it right the first time, what makes you think you're gonna have time to do it right a second time? I spent a week studying wiring diagrams, a day or so building that document, and probably 4 full days of doing that wiring. And because I took my time, I feel like I made far less mistakes. Which is a good lead in to number 4, check often. My handwriting is getting sloppier as we go. Check Check your work often. I would stop about every 10 wires and go back and recheck the previous 10. There were a couple of times where I actually moved pins into the wrong spot in that 91 pin connector. It's easy to do, especially when you've been doing that for days or hours on end. If you wait till you're all the way done, now you might have 30 steps to go back and recheck, where if you check it often, you might only have 5 or 6. And number 5, do it right. What do I mean by do it right? Of course you want to do it right. Listen, doing an engine swap can be very expensive and very time consuming. The last thing I want to see is for you to spend all that time and all that money, buy all this stuff, only to have your wiring not be good or not be right. Take some pride in your work, do it good. My goal for that car was to make it look like everything came from the factory that way. Even if that's not you, that's totally cool, but this is a place where you can really shine and prove that you can do a good job. So don't do things like use twist wire nuts meant for your house in your car wiring. Do things like flush cut your zip ties. So if you follow these steps, I guarantee 100% you're not gonna make a single mistake. All right, I'm just kidding. You still might make a mistake. I know I did, but what I will tell you, if you follow these steps, your mistakes will be fewer and farther between. And really the important thing, they'll be a lot less catastrophic when you make them. Okay, we have demystified wiring for an engine swap. There is no more gatekeeping on this swap. You know it all, and you too can do a swap just like this, or even cooler than what we did. But until then, enjoy this wiring compilation of this RS3 swapped Golf R.